I never really bought into the whole idea of intuition until that Friday night changed everything. I'm Michael, 42 years old, and I've always prided myself on being logical, a man of reason, not feelings. But as soon as I saw Amanda walk through the door, something in me just knew something was off. There she was, standing in the hallway, and at first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Yet as I got closer, I caught a scent that wasn't hers at all. Instead of her familiar floral perfume, there was a strong, unmistakable whiff of something masculine, like a mix of aftershave and alcohol. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Amanda, who had always been so meticulous about her appearance, looked different. Today, she had fixed her hair with unusual care, almost as if she was preparing for a meeting rather than coming home. And there was a brief moment, just as our eyes met, when I saw her quickly typing out a message on her phone. Too quick, too secretive. I stood there, frozen for a split second, before my mind kicked in. With a calmness I didn't feel at all, I asked, "Who is he?" The words left my lips in a measured tone, but every syllable dripped with cold determination. I could see the surprise flicker across her face, a flash of guilt maybe, before she tried to mask it with a strained smile. I remember thinking how surreal the situation felt. I'd never considered myself the jealous type, the kind to jump to conclusions on a whim. But something about that scent, that hurried glance at her phone, it all felt like a warning bell ringing in my head. In that moment, the foundations of our relationship, which I'd taken for granted, began to tremble. I tried to keep my voice steady, even though inside I was a tempest of confusion and hurt. "Amanda, what's going on?" I pressed, wanting to understand, yet dreading the answer. Her eyes darted away for a moment before she came back to meet mine. The hesitation in her gaze told me everything I needed to know, and yet it wasn't enough. I needed the full truth. The conversation that followed was a haze of half-truths and evasions. She told me she'd met someone at a bar, a friend from work, she claimed, and that nothing was out of the ordinary. But her tone, the way she kept her eyes glued to her phone, made it clear that this wasn't just a simple recounting of an evening out. There was more beneath the surface, a story she wasn't telling me. I felt like I was listening to a stranger trying to convince me of something that didn't add up. At that moment, every rational part of me was screaming to walk away, to shut down this painful intrusion into our life. Yet a deeper, more primal part of me, one I'd always dismissed as superstition, demanded that I unravel this mystery, to understand exactly what was happening between us. It was as if my intuition, long silent, had suddenly awakened and was urging me to peel back the layers of deceit. I decided then that I couldn't let this slide. I needed answers not just for me, but for the sanctity of the life Amanda and I had built together. And as I looked at her, trying to decipher every subtle cue in her expression, I realized that everything we thought we knew about each other was about to be tested. That Friday night marked the beginning of a series of events I could never have predicted. Events that would force me to question not only my trust in Amanda, but also my own perceptions of reality. I was on the cusp of a journey that would expose secrets, betrayals, and unexpected alliances. And while part of me wanted to retreat into the comforting realm of logic and reason, another part, the one that had always whispered that there was more to life than meets the eye, urged me forward into the unknown. Looking back now, I know that night was a turning point. It wasn't just about a possible betrayal. It was about confronting the vulnerability of the heart and the mysteries of human connection. That lingering scent, that hurried message, it was all the beginning of a story filled with twists and turns. A story that would challenge every belief I once held. And as I sit here, recounting it all, I realize that sometimes, intuition isn't a lie at all. The evidence was undeniable. Amanda tried to spin a tale about being out with friends, but I had a snapshot that shattered her carefully constructed facade. The photo was from an upscale restaurant, a place where dinner alone could easily set you back $500. And there she was, seated with a man whose hand rested casually, yet unmistakably on her leg. Every detail screamed betrayal. I looked at her, trying to gauge her reaction, but the sight of that picture had already spoken volumes. I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers, already signed and ready to be served. Without a trace of emotion, I laid them on the table and said, "You have 15 minutes to sign and collect your things." Her mask of calm began to crack immediately. At first, it was just a slight tremor in her eyes, a flash of something raw and desperate. But I knew this was only the beginning. I watched as her hands trembled slightly, and the composure she'd maintained for so long started to crumble. Every second that ticked by felt like the final moments of a life we'd once built together. In that charged silence, the reality of our situation sank in. It wasn't merely about a misplaced hand on a leg or an expensive dinner. It was about every secret, every lie that had been tucked away beneath the surface of our marriage. And now there was no hiding. I had the evidence, and I had the resolve to end it once and for all. For me, it wasn't just a matter of hurt pride or wounded trust. It was a long time coming, a culmination of instincts and overlooked signs that now screamed out in the harsh light of betrayal. The evidence was concrete, the act was irrefutable, and the decision was final. In that moment, the life we'd known together split in two, and I knew there was no going back. I stood there, watching her struggle to reconcile the person I once knew with the reality laid bare before her. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second that ticked by was a countdown to the inevitable. This wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the start of something much more turbulent and unpredictable. And as she finally reached for the pen, I couldn't help but feel that this was just the opening act of a drama that would soon spiral into something far more convoluted than either of us could have ever imagined. The moment after I laid down the divorce papers, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Just then, as if summoned by fate, the door swung open with a soft yet decisive click. In walked Karen, 40 years old, with an aura of controlled fury that instantly shifted the atmosphere into something even more volatile. She was the wife of Amanda's lover, a person whose very presence now magnified the betrayal we were all entangled in. Clutching her phone like a weapon, Karen's eyes were cold and unwavering, as if she had come to mete out a long-overdue punishment. "Thought you could get away with it?" Karen's voice broke the heavy silence. It was calm, measured even, but every word dripped with a seething anger that resonated deeply in every corner of the room. Her tone was not merely an accusation. It was a declaration that the facade of deceit was over. There was no room for half-truths or evasions now. Amanda's reaction was immediate, a mix of shock and desperate indignation that was all too transparent. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw the mask of composure we had all witnessed start to slip. She opened her mouth to form an explanation, but before she could articulate another lie, Karen calmly navigated her phone. With deliberate precision, Karen hit play on a recording that would expose everything. The video filled the space, and every second felt like a stab. The footage was damning. There was Amanda, unmistakably caught in an intimate embrace with her husband, in the lavish confines of a hotel room that cost a staggering $800 a night. Their kiss was captured in raw detail, a moment of betrayal broadcast for all to see. The evidence was indisputable, and as the video played on, it was like watching our lives unravel in real time. I felt a bitter mixture of vindication and sorrow. For years, I had wrestled with doubts and ignored subtle signals of deceit. And now, the reality of the situation was laid bare in front of me. Every second of the video was a piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that painted a grim picture of betrayal that had been carefully hidden behind lies and half-hearted denials. Amanda's attempts to salvage her version of events crumbled before the unyielding truth of the recording. The room seemed to contract under the weight of the revelation. Karen's presence added an unforeseen complexity to the situation. Not only was Amanda's infidelity exposed, but now the fallout involved another person directly affected by her actions. A person whose own life had been upended by this betrayal. Karen's calm yet fierce expression was a reminder that in the web of lies, no one was an innocent bystander. The room was no longer just a battleground between Amanda and me. It had become an arena where multiple lives collided in a storm of hurt and retribution. I stood there, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal and the cold, hard clarity that came with undeniable evidence. The video wasn't just a recording. It was a statement, Every frame narrated the hidden truths that had been festering beneath the surface of our carefully constructed lives. Amanda's eyes, once brimming with practiced confidence, now flickered with panic and regret. She fumbled for words, her voice shaking as she tried to offer explanations that now fell flat against the stark reality laid out by Karen. In that charged moment, the boundaries of our world shifted irreversibly. The sound of the video mingled with the heavy silence of the room, each passing second marking the end of an era, a time when trust and loyalty could be taken for granted. Instead, we were confronted with a harsh truth. The life we had built was irrevocably tainted by deception, and every carefully guarded secret was now exposed. Karen's calm demeanor in delivering such a harsh revelation was both unsettling and awe-inspiring. She didn't just serve as a messenger of truth. She was an active participant in the reckoning. Her eyes met Amanda's, unblinking and resolute, as if daring her to offer any counterargument. The intensity in that gaze was enough to silence any remaining defenses Amanda might have mustered. As I absorbed the scene unfolding before me, I couldn't help but reflect on the layers of betrayal that had led to this moment. It was as though every suppressed intuition, every ignored red flag, had culminated in this explosive confrontation. The room was charged with an energy that was equal parts anger and despair, a visceral reminder that sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, has a way of emerging when you least expect it. Now, everything was laid out bare. The lies, the stolen moments, the secrets hidden behind expensive dinners and clandestine meetings. The video played on, a relentless reminder that in the end, truth always finds a way to surface. And as I stood there, caught between the ruins of our shattered past and the uncertain promise of what was to come, I realized that this moment was more than just an end. It was a turning point, a gateway to a future where nothing could ever be the same again. I watched Amanda's eyes dart back and forth as I laid out the ultimatum: sign the divorce papers or watch our entire sordid history. The secrets, the betrayals, every whispered lie, explode into the public domain. I knew it was a harsh choice, but I had reached the end of my tether. There was no going back now. Amanda's mind raced, trying desperately to twist the situation, to paint me as the inattentive partner who had somehow missed all the warning signs. She spat out accusations of neglect, claiming I'd been too absorbed in work, too distracted to notice the subtle hints of her infidelity. But I remained unmoved, my expression as cold and resolute as the finality of the documents on the table. The air between us was thick with tension when Amanda, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, turned her venomous words towards Karen. In that heated moment, she lashed out verbally, hoping to demean Karen and shift the blame. But Karen, who had been the catalyst for our unraveling, would have none of it. Without a moment's hesitation, Karen's hand met Amanda's cheek with a sharp, resounding slap. The sound reverberated through the room, a stark punctuation that silenced all our attempts at rationality. It was as if the crack of that slap erased any remaining pretense, leaving only raw, unfiltered truth. For a brief moment, everything froze. The shock, the hurt, the fury all mingled in the charged silence that followed. I could see the sting in Amanda's eyes, the mix of disbelief and humiliation that now painted her face. It was a turning point, a line drawn in the sand that marked the absolute end of our charade. In that instant, I repeated in a tone that brooked no argument, "Sign and get out." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I could feel the weight of every decision that had led me to this moment. The ignored instincts, the small signs I had dismissed until they piled up into an avalanche of betrayal. There was no room for negotiation, no second-guessing. This was the only way to salvage what little dignity remained amidst the chaos. Amanda's mouth opened and closed like a trapped bird, desperately searching for something, anything, to say. Her mind, once so adept at weaving stories to cover her tracks, now seemed to falter under the crushing evidence of her own making. The room, still echoing with the sharp sound of Karen's slap, now felt like a courtroom where every accusation was laid bare and every lie exposed. I sat there, feeling a strange blend of relief and sorrow. On one hand, the decision was irrevocable, the the final act in a long saga of deceit and betrayal. On the other, the pain of watching someone I had once loved spiral into a confrontation that left no room for redemption was almost too much to bear. Yet, as I looked at Amanda, I saw not just the person who had shattered our life together, but the embodiment of every broken promise and shattered illusion. Karen's eyes, still alight with a controlled fury, met mine. In that brief exchange, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent understanding that we were both victims of a betrayal that had ensnared us in a web of our own making. It wasn't just Amanda who had been deceived. We were all caught in the crossfire of choices made in haste and consequences left to unravel in their own time. The ultimatum was simple: sign or face the world. I knew that if I let the secret spill, there would be no escape from the inevitable fallout. A public spectacle that would expose not just the infidelity, but every layer of manipulation and hurt that had festered between us. The thought of it sent a chill through me, yet it was a necessary evil. I couldn't allow my pain to become a spectacle, nor could I let our private hell become public entertainment. Time seemed to stretch on as Amanda hesitated, the minutes ticking by with an agonizing slowness. The silence was punctuated only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a city that had no idea of the storm raging within these walls. Each second that passed without a decision felt like a lifetime. A final chance for Amanda to come to her senses and acknowledge the truth, no matter how bitter it was. Finally, the inevitable happened. With trembling hands and eyes filled with a cocktail of regret and resignation, Amanda reached for the pen. In that moment, every accusation, every hurtful word exchanged, crystallized into a single, unyielding act of finality. The pen moved slowly at first, as if reluctant to betray the last vestiges of the past. But with each stroke of ink, the story of betrayal, shattered dreams, and irrevocable decisions was sealed. As the last signature was scrawled onto the document, I felt an odd sense of release. It was as though the weight of all those years of doubt, of every moment I had tried to ignore the signs, was finally lifting. The decision was made, the truth was out, and now there was only one path forward. A future where the scars of this day would eventually become lessons etched deep into the fabric of who I was. I looked around the room one final time, taking in every detail: the overturned chair, the silent witnesses of shattered promises, the lingering echo of a slap that had spoken louder than any words ever could. With a deep, steadying breath, I realized that sometimes the only choice you have is the one that forces you to confront the painful truth head-on, without any illusions of compromise. In that moment, as Amanda collected her things and prepared to leave, I understood that this was more than just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where every decision was a step away from the past and towards a future defined by its own, harsh clarity. And though the road ahead promised to be just as treacherous, at least now, for the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my own narrative. The tension in the room didn't have a chance to settle when Karen dropped another bombshell. With a cold sort of satisfaction, she informed Amanda that her lover already knew everything, and that he was on his way. The words hung in the air like a curse. I could feel the temperature drop another notch, as if the very walls were bracing themselves for what was to come. Before anyone could react, the door burst open again. In strode Alex, Karen's husband, 45 years old and practically a walking storm cloud. His face was twisted with fury, eyes blazing with a mix of disbelief and seething rage. The moment he stepped into the room, it was clear that he was on the verge of exploding. The room seemed to constrict around him as his presence demanded attention. "How could you?" Alex roared, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. The sound of his outburst reverberated off the walls, drowning out any lingering conversation. It was a declaration, a raw, visceral cry of betrayal that shattered whatever remnants of calm might have still clung to the room. Amanda's face drained of color. She fumbled with words, desperately trying to cobble together an excuse, but it was all too late. The truth, now stark and undeniable, stood as an insurmountable barrier to any half-hearted rationalization she might have tried to muster. I watched as her mouth opened and closed, a silent plea for a lifeline that simply wasn't there. Alex's gaze swept the room, and when it landed on me, it was loaded with contempt. With a sneer that cut deeper than any knife, he spat out, "Destroy her. She deserves it." The command, uttered with a venom that echoed through the charged atmosphere, sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just an order. It was a declaration of war, a promise of retribution against Amanda for the countless lies and betrayals that had led to this point. In that moment, everything spiraled further into chaos. The room, already a battleground of shattered trust and raw emotions, became a tinderbox waiting for a spark. I could see that Alex's fury was not just about Amanda's betrayal. It was an amalgamation of betrayal, humiliation, and a twisted sense of justice that he believed was owed to him. His eyes, hard and unyielding, locked onto mine for a split second, as if to warn me that I was now part of a dangerous equation. Karen's expression was unreadable as she surveyed the scene. A mix of cold satisfaction and the burden of knowing that her own life was now irrevocably intertwined with this explosive drama. The realization that the consequences of this betrayal were escalating beyond control began to sink in. We were no longer dealing with the private failures of a crumbling marriage. We had crossed into a territory where personal vendettas and public humiliation were about to collide. As the seconds ticked by in a tense, almost surreal silence, I felt the weight of responsibility press down on me. I had been the one to lay bare the evidence, to force this brutal confrontation, and now I was caught in the crossfire of a personal war that had grown far larger than I had ever anticipated. Every instinct in me screamed that this was a powder keg, ready to ignite at any moment, and I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what was coming next. The air vibrated with the unsaid threats, and even though I had expected a cathartic release from the truth, what I encountered was a maelstrom of anger and a desire for revenge that left no room for compassion. Alex's command was more than just a call for punishment. It was a final severance, a violent severing of ties that would ripple through every aspect of our lives. In that charged moment, the boundaries of our broken relationships seemed to shatter entirely. Amanda's eyes darted around, trying to gauge if there was any escape from the imminent storm. But the reality was inescapable. Her world, built on layers of deceit and half-truths, was collapsing around her. And in the midst of this unraveling, I was left grappling with the enormity of the situation. I wondered if I had ever truly understood the full scope of what betrayal could cost, not just in love or trust, but in the human capacity for vengeance. The echoes of Alex's furious decree lingered in the air as we all stood there, caught between the ruins of what had once been our lives and the violent promise of what was to come. The room, now charged with a palpable menace, bore silent witness to the collision of lives marked by betrayal, deceit, and an unyielding thirst for retribution. And as the chaos of emotions threatened to spill over into actions that none of us could foresee, one thing became unmistakably clear: there was no going back. The consequences had escalated far beyond our control, and the storm that was coming would change everything. Forever. I remember the moment as if it were etched in slow motion. Karen's voice cut through the charged atmosphere with a cold finality. "I sent the evidence to your management," she announced, her tone as unyielding as iron. "Your manager and colleagues now know about your addiction." The words hit Amanda like a tidal wave. Her complexion drained to a ghostly pallor in an instant. I watched in stunned silence as she fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers. Within seconds, a deluge of new messages flooded her screen. Alerts, calls, and texts confirming what Karen had just said. Amanda's once impregnable facade crumbled as the reality set in. She had lost her high-profile job, the one that paid her a staggering $250,000 per year. The evidence of her double life was now public, and the fallout was immediate. Her eyes widened in shock and terror, and then a scream erupted from deep within her. It wasn't just the loss of a career. It was the collapse of a carefully constructed life, a life built on secrets and half-truths. In a desperate, almost primal reaction, Amanda lunged toward Karen, as if to punish her for the betrayal. But before she could make contact, I stepped in. I grabbed Amanda firmly by the arm, holding her back as her fury and despair threatened to become physically destructive. "You did it yourself," I said, my voice a mix of sorrow and resignation. The words echoed around the room like a final verdict. It was a moment that encapsulated the tragic irony of our situation. Every lie, every deceit, had led her to this point. There was no one to blame but herself. For a long, heavy moment, time seemed to stand still. Amanda struggled against my grip, her eyes wild and desperate. But then, as if surrendering to the inevitability of her fate, she broke free from my hold. With one last, haunted look, she snatched her bag from the corner of the room. The room felt charged with the weight of her decision. A final, irrevocable severing of ties to the life she had known. Without another word, Amanda bolted for the door. I watched her run, her steps frantic and unsteady, as she fled from the ruin of her once glittering world. Behind her, the echoes of her shattered life reverberated in the silence. Karen's face remained stoically unmoved, a mask of cold satisfaction that barely concealed the depth of her own complicated emotions. And there I stood, caught in the crossfire of betrayal and retribution, feeling the bitter sting of what had been lost. In that moment, everything had irrevocably changed. The empire of lies Amanda had built had finally crumbled, leaving nothing but the harsh light of truth in its wake. The evidence, once hidden away in the shadows, now lay bare for all to see, exposing not only her infidelities but also the facade of perfection she had maintained at all costs. I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Amanda had spent years carefully constructing a life of illusions, a delicate balance of success and secrecy. And now, in a single devastating moment, it had all unraveled. The high-powered career that had defined her identity was gone, replaced by a cold, inescapable reality of public humiliation and personal ruin. As I looked around the room, the remnants of our once shared past lay scattered like broken dreams. The documents, the evidence, the raw, painful truth, they were all reminders that sometimes the final blow is not delivered by an outside force, but by the choices we make for ourselves. Amanda's scream, her desperate attempt to cling to something, even in the midst of her downfall, was a tragic testament to that reality. Now, standing in the aftermath of this explosive reckoning, I couldn't help but wonder about the uncertain road ahead. The storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake, but also the promise of a future unburdened by lies. As the door clicked shut behind Amanda, I realized that every ending, no matter how painful, carries within it the seed of a new beginning. A chance to rebuild from the ruins of a life once defined by secrets and deceit. Later that night, Karen and I found ourselves at a chic bar tucked away in the heart of the city. The kind of place where the decor whispered elegance. A mix of vintage leather chairs, glistening crystal chandeliers, and soft jazz floating in the background. We settled into a secluded booth, the clink of silverware and murmured conversations blending with the gentle hum of the city outside. We ordered whiskey, each glass a cool $100, the kind that promised smooth, lingering warmth. As the amber liquid filled our glasses, I couldn't help but reflect on how surreal the day had been. Just hours before, our lives had been tangled in a web of deceit and betrayal. Now, here I was, sitting with Karen, the very woman who had unwittingly become a key figure in dismantling a ruined life. Between sips of that expensive whiskey, we started talking about life, the kind of conversation that felt both cathartic and liberating. Karen's eyes, still guarded yet unexpectedly candid, met mine as we shared our thoughts about the future. We laughed, sometimes at the absurdity of our circumstances, sometimes at the irony of finding solace in each other after the chaos of the day. For a while, the weight of betrayal and loss lifted, replaced by the simple pleasure of connection. Outside the bar, the night was alive with possibility, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. The burden of secrets and the sting of betrayal were slowly melting away, replaced by a cautious optimism for what lay ahead. Karen leaned in, her voice softer now. "Do you think she'll come back?" Her question hung in the air, a mixture of curiosity and a touch of lingering concern. I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. "Sure," I replied, the corners of my mouth lifting ever so slightly. Women like that never go quietly, but it's not my problem now. The humor in my tone was as much a defense mechanism as it was a declaration of moving on. In that moment, I was determined not to let the remnants of the past drag me back into its orbit. Meanwhile, in the chaotic aftermath of the day's events, Amanda was scrambling to salvage what little remained of her shattered life. I later learned that she had tried to reach out to Alex, perhaps hoping for some form of support or reconciliation, but he refused to acknowledge her calls. His silence was as final as the signatures on those divorce papers, a clear indication that the consequences of her choices were not just hers to bear. Back at the bar, Karen and I raised our glasses. We toasted to the mistakes that had led us here and to the lessons learned in the wake of devastation. Our glasses clinked softly, a gentle reminder that from the ruins of the past, one can forge a new beginning. The taste of the whiskey, smooth yet potent, became a metaphor for our lives. Complex, layered, and surprisingly hopeful despite the bitterness of recent events. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. The oppressive weight of a life built on illusions and half-truths had been replaced by the exhilarating possibility of authenticity. There was a clarity in the cool night air and in the sincerity of Karen's conversation. A clarity that promised that I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace a future unburdened by regret. In that moment, I realized that every end, no matter how painful, carves out space for a fresh start. The mistakes of yesterday, though costly, were the stepping stones toward a new path. And as Karen and I sat there, sharing dreams and unspoken hopes over expensive whiskey, I knew that I was not defined by the betrayals of the past, but by the courage to move forward. So here's to new beginnings, where we learn from our missteps, where the echoes of betrayal fade into the background, and where we finally allow ourselves to be free. With each sip, the taste of the whiskey reminded me that sometimes, letting go is the bravest thing we can do, and that sometimes, the best way to honor our past is to toast to a future that holds promise and redemption.